May the words of my lips and the meditations of all of our hearts help us find the road home. Hello, Eugene. I'm the Reverend Lois Van Leer. I'm your new developmental minister, which means that you and I, are about to live in sin for the next 4 years. For my time with you will not end in a settled call or a marriage-like commitment. And by the end of my time with you, you will have been in 2 serially monogamous relationships with ministers. Put your 2 developmental ministerial relationships into this framework. Practice for the real thing. That's not to say that any of the ministry done by my predecessors or any of the work that we shall do together will not be ministry, real ministry. But it does mean that for some time now, you have not experienced a ministry that was defined by the call and response of settled ministry. That call process wherein a congregation seeks out a minister to call their own with all these lists of qualifications and throw them all out the window because they fall in love with the person. And the minister seeks out a congregation they think they want, one they can call their own, a place they can make a difference, and they fall in love with the congregation. It's a difference. It's the difference between living together and choosing marriage. After 35 years of working with couples who enter the covenant of marriage, I know that the ritual act of marriage changes something in a relationship. Whether you are partners of 1.5 years or partners of 25 years. My job over the next 4 years is to get you ready for the marriage of a settled ministry. Let me put all of this another way. My job is to bark at the choir. That phrase comes from a story told by Father Gregory Boyle, a priest who lived and worked for decades with gangs in Los Angeles. He's also the founder of Homeboy Industries that provides work for former gang members. Some of you may have read his first book, Tattoos of the Heart. He begins his second book, Barking to the Choir, by describing his work there with this story. A young gang member who was working in the bakery was walking a fine edge between breaking free and out of a life or falling back into an old lifestyle. So after Boyle gives him an attitude-ectomy, the young man says to Boyle, "Don't sweat it, bald-headed. You're barking to the choir." Boyle says that the marriage of barking up the wrong tree to preaching to the choir works. For, he says, it calls for a rethinking of our status quo. No longer satisfied with the way the world is lulled into operating and yearning for a new vision. It is on the lookout for ways to confound and deconstruct. Shouldn't that be the role of church in today's world? Boyle goes on to talk about, quote, the occupational hazard of being human, finding ourselves stuck. In the life of congregations, that translates as, we've never done it this way before. He says that it's fear that keeps us stuck. Well, of course it is. We like the familiar, the known. Change is hard. It's frightening. It puts us on high survival alert internally. And change brings about not only potential and possibility, but fear and tension, even in conflict or the fear of conflict. To a person, you have all welcomed me warmly. And yet I am sure that deep down, there is an accompanying, subtle, simmering fear that I will change or threaten what you hold most dear about this community. But if you've been in meetings with me, you will find that I ask a lot of questions, and I question some of the ways in which this particular church does the work of being a church. I am full of strategies and ideas that I am not shy about putting out there. I am from New York, after all. But if you've been listening, beyond the fear and the terror some of these ideas bring up, you will also have heard me say that whatever it is that I propose or that we come up with together, it has to work for this particular congregation. The work we will engage in together is the work of making this church work for you. That means taking some deep dives into systems or the ways that things are done. It means evaluating what the best practices are to allow all of us to be freed up, to broaden our gaze into the larger community. For as someone said to me, Reverend Sidney got us down off the hill. Now you all have to decide how to live in this new context. Who are you here? What will define your identity? What will people say about the Unitarian Universalist Church of Eugene in the larger community? Because my ministry with you marks yet another time of transition for you as a community, it is a time to be mindful. Change brings out the best and the worst in us. Marcia McPhee, Methodist minister who goes around the country doing workshops on worship, says, when people fight about worship, I know you never do, they're really fighting about theology. I have come to realize that when people fight about money, they're really fighting about power and control. When people are fighting change, they are really trying to stem off grief and loss. So this time can be one where we are unconsciously walking around with our hackles up on our backs, just waiting for the first move to be made that will set off any of the above in a chain reaction. This is when we need to give ourselves over to love and not succumb to our fears. As Boyle points out, when we are stuck, when we settle or give up challenging centuries-old patterns, we lose sight of the model of church or beloved community as a place of inclusivity, kindness, and tenderness. In UU land, that's often referred to as the beloved community. Imagine pairing kinship, inclusivity, and tenderness with 3 words from your mission statement: love, transformation, and service. That's worth barking at the choir for, yes? You know, my job really isn't to change this congregation. It is to remind you of who you are when you are at your best or what you aspire to be. This congregation's been around since the 1800s. That's like the beginning of Unitarian Universalism in this country, much less in the West. That's a lot of years. A lot of times where I'm sure folks settled for the status quo or felt themselves stuck. I imagine that the stories or narratives of those years made their way down with you from the church on the hill to this building and linger still. Every question I ask here is answered with a story that dates back to a time in your collective history. What I'm interested in is mining those stories for a usable past. What from the past is something worth carrying forward and building upon? What stories are you telling that somehow keep you stuck? I'm not talking about sweeping things under the carpet, but about making a choice about the story you will tell yourselves about yourselves. The First Nations writer Leslie Marmon Silko wrote, "I will tell you something about stories. They aren't just entertainment. Don't be fooled. They are all we have to fight off illness and death. They are all we have." Some of you may be familiar with the work of Byron Katie, who teaches, quote, the work of self-inquiry. She asks folks to apply these 4 questions to their thoughts or to the stories they tell themselves. The first is it true? And we go, yep. Second question, can you absolutely know that it's true? Well, no. So how do you react, and what happens when you believe that thought? Ouch. 4, who would you be without that thought? Who would you be without that thought? And that's the question that interests me. What would this congregation be without certain stories or thoughts? As Boyle would say, so the choir gets barked at collectively, and we move beyond the mind we have. You all get to move beyond the stories you have told, the narratives that have been created, the ones that have gotten you stuck or settled you into a status quo. What new story or narrative needs to be created to be able to live into the marriage of inclusivity, kindness, tenderness, love, transformation, and service? Because I know I want to be a part of that community. Because I know the world needs that kind of community. Because I know there are folks who are hungry and desperate for that kind of community. With more ways than ever to connect today in our world, we are lonelier than we have ever been as a species. I know that Unitarian Universalism is life and spirit saving. I know that given the state of our world, there is an urgency to ensure that this community be one of inclusivity, kinship, tenderness, love, transformation, and service. So earlier I tossed out a word and we all laughed. Can you guess what that word was? Sin. Well, worship, that's, you're doing that, you're stuck. But it's sin. And it's one of those shut down, stop listening, put your fingers in your ear and go la 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 for Unitarian Universalists. And because such traditional religious language carries with it its own particular meanings and context, need I say baggage for some of us, I find it necessary to define exactly what I mean by such words when I use them with you. You remember it was Thomas Starr King who is credited with this famous quip. The Universalists think God is too good to damn them forever. The Unitarians think they are too good to be damned forever. The idea of sin never even enters into the equation. But I'd like you to try this one on for size. The word sin comes from the Greek word hamartia, which means to miss the mark. To miss the mark. Is there anyone Yeah, I'm looking at you all too. Is there anyone in this room who can honestly say that they have never missed the mark in thought, word, or deed? More specifically, in your relationships with your beloveds? When I came into UU a little over 15 years ago, I kept hearing about covenant and right relationship. The idea of covenant is what Unitarian Universalism is built on in this country. A colleague of mine defined God for me those 15 years ago as, quote, the possibility of right relationship. To me, as a relative newcomer, these two concepts seem to be at the fore as correctives to the way in which UUs were missing the mark in how they related to one another. In a General Assembly workshop, the former minister of the Portland church, you know, the big church, Reverend Marilyn Sewell, talked about distorted interpretations of our polity and our principles that has not led to beloved community, but to the tyranny of the few and, in some cases, anarchy in our churches. She looked at all of us in the room and said, "Stop it." We were a denomination run amok with folks missing the mark with one another in relationship in the name of religious freedom. And at the same time, covenants were being used as baseball bats to end such behavior. Covenants are aspirations and our intentions. They define the ways in which we want to be in relationship with one another. They will always be broken. When I do pre-counseling with couples who want to get married, I always say, you better forgive each other now for the ways in which you're going to break every single one of those vows. Because you know it's true. The problem is, when we talk about covenant without any ways to restore them, when they've been transgressed, without any way to restore a broken relationship, when we have missed the mark with one another, we're lost. We're not very good at that. The other thing is, we're a perfectionistic people who, the printer printed out my pages in a very interesting way. So, Miss Tech, I am not. Anyway, we are perfectionistic people. I missed the mark. Who, if we are hard on one another, are even harder on ourselves. That's a narrative that could stand some barking at, an attitude-ectomy. Tonight, observant Jews will begin their new year with the high holy days of Rosh Hashanah. The task during this time is that of serious introspection, self-evaluation, and prayer. It's an annual personal and collective accounting or inventory of the soul. For 8 days, Jews repent, turn back, go beyond the minds that they have, seeking forgiveness for transgressions against persons and their God. Now, what I just told you is the Reader's Digest explanation of these high holy days, adapted for my purposes this morning. As a UU, I long for a ritualized way to restore covenants that are broken, to repair relationships in which I have missed the mark, to eject the stories and narratives that keep me or a community stuck, for ways, as the saying goes, to call one another in, not out, to call one another back into right relationship. But like everything else in the world of church right now, we have to make it up as we go along. For we are in the place of knowing that the way we have always done church no longer works. But we don't know what the future church looks like. We are in that in-between place with no map, no blueprint, no compass. I will say this again and again. We are making up the church of the present and the future as we go. There are rights and wrongs, but mostly it is discovering, uncovering, reclaiming, imagining what works for us in this particular community and context. For what we have always done will not take us where we want to go. We are quite literally building the path as we take the steps. What I can say is that I think church needs to be a place of refuge, a place where we can safely lay down all those pieces of our lives that are broken. James Luther Adams, who is one of our 20th century Unitarian theologians, said that church is the place where we practice being human. Church needs to be a place where we lay it all down, a place of challenge and even discomfort, at the same time, a place of safety. It needs to be a place where we discover what it is we are freed to pick up once we lay down what needs laying down. It needs to be a place where we can bring our whole selves, all of what makes each of us uniquely human. Theodore Parker, one of the three greats who shaped Unitarianism in this country in the 1800s, famously wrote, this was not Martin Luther King, as everybody thought. This is our own person. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Many of us has taken that as the core of our faith, to work to bend the arc of the universe toward justice. I would like to suggest that we pair that work with the work that Father Boyle talks about, bending the world toward grace. And because grace is another one of those words, I'm going to offer you a couple of definitions. And the first one is from Charlene Spretnak. And those of you who are involved in the women's spirituality movement in the 1980s might remember her because she is known for reviving some of the goddess traditions that had been lost. And this is her definition of grace. When we experience consciousness or the unity in which we are embedded, the sacred whole that is, and around us, we exist in a state of grace. It is a gift that is given. It sounds a lot like our seventh principle. And if you don't know it, the gray hymnals aren't out today. Okay, in the front of the gray hymnals, our principles are listed. Just saying. The second definition is from a wonderful Christian writer and theologian, Frederick Buechner, and he says this: listen to your life. See it for the fathomless mystery that it is. In the boredom and the pain of it, no less than in the excitement and the gladness, touch, taste, smell your way to the holy and hidden heart of it, because in the last analysis, all moments are key moments, and life itself is grace. I would simply add to that concept of grace that it's the unexpected relief of the internal lifting of the veil that keeps us stuck or locked into a personal sense of less than-ness. So imagine the pairing or the marriage of the bendings of the universe toward justice and grace. Pure potential. Now add inclusivity, kinship, tenderness, love, transformation, service. If we do that, now we're on to something. And it's going to require some vigilant barking by all of us. May it be so.